spoiler alert, you cannot breathe from your diaphragm, nor can you sing from it. We do not take air. Air happens. So remember, you create your instrument anew every time you breathe in. Hi, my name is Lynn Helding. I am a voice teacher, a voice researcher, an author, and a voice pedagogue, developer of science-informed voice training. In the previous segment, we did an overview of the voice as an entire instrument. In this segment of the series of science-informed voice training, we are going to talk about respiration and do a much deeper dive. Before we do that, we'll just do a quick overview of the voice and of science-informed voice training in particular, which I define as a kind of pedagogy that unites science and art. It's very important to understand that it's not bound by science. It's informed by science, but importantly, it takes advantage of all the artistic knowledge about singing voice that is already out there and has been here for hundreds of years, and builds on that by current research in voice science and what we know about how the voice works. So we talked about in the previous segment how the voice has three parts in common with all other instruments, and that is a motor, something that makes it go. In the case of piano, it's your hands and the hammer, something that makes it vibrate. In the case of piano, we have the string that creates the sound, and then finally something that resonates, or something that takes that vibration and gathers it in a box. In the case of the piano, it is the sound board and literally the box of the piano that helps amplify the sound as well as create its distinctive timbre. So what is voice? The human voice uses as its actuator, as its power source, not just the lungs, but the entire apparatus, which is what we'll be talking about today, the entire respiratory apparatus, which creates air, which passes through the vocal folds, and those vocal folds begin to vibrate and turn that air into sound waves, which then go up through the vocal tract, which is the resonator of the human voice. And finally, we have the ability to make language with 9 different body parts that combine to make words. This is our special gift as singers, that we have the ability to communicate not just in musical tone, but with text. So today we're talking about the actuator, respiration. And it's really important that we think of this machine that drives the voice as a multi-part apparatus. Now, as you might imagine, in this part of the body, there are lots and lots of body parts to talk about. There are primary muscles of inspiration and expiration, and secondary muscles of inspiration and expiration. And if you look at all of that musculature, and it's not just muscles, there are some bones and even some cartilage involved, it becomes a very, very, very long list. And honestly, for singers, we don't need that long list. We can go back to just thinking of some of the bigger parts of this apparatus. And those parts, the most important, are the framework, which is the rib cage, and then the muscles between the ribs, and finally, the entire abdominal wall and a supporting structure of muscles that hold all of that together. That's enough for us to learn about today. So we start with understanding we're talking about inspiration, that is bringing air in, and then we're talking about expiration. Now, why do we care about both parts of that process? Well, obviously, we have to inspire breath to live. We care also about the expiratory process because it is on that expiration of air that singing actually happens. So we start with the inspiratory muscles. The two most important for us as singers are the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. So we have a picture here of the respiratory apparatus or machine. And this is just a schematic that gives us a really nice idea of what we're up against as singers. So when we breathe in, we can see some of these arrows. You see that the side of the body, that is the rib cage, wants to sort of flare up and out. And we also see that in general, we want that diaphragm to go down and the abdominal muscles to relax outward this way so that we can fill up with air. And then when we expire to use that sound, that air to turn into sound power, obviously all those things go in reverse. Now, trained singers learn how to delay that going into reverse so we last as long as possible. And we'll get to that in a minute. So let's go back to our three parts of the apparatus. We had the rib cage, the muscles between the rib cage, and then all of those abdominal wall muscles. Let's look at the structural part of this, which is the rib cage. It's often described that during inspiration, the sternum, that is the bone that connects those ribs, will flare up and out. And the sides kind of flare this way. So we have this one is like they say like a pump handle, and this is like a bucket handle that swings this way. Um, Great singers learn how to manipulate that. They learn how to use that. So you'll see when you see great singers on stage, notice that their posture is always what the Italians call noble posture. It's very lifted. We never see any sort of sunken chest or collapsed rib cage. And that's because we want to have that volume open as much as possible. Now, it's important at this point, I want to say something that young singers obviously have a lot of misconceptions about. They become very focused on taking a big breath. And we'll see later on in our another series, in another segment in this series, which is phonation, why that's not a good idea. But for now, let's just think about capacity. It's really important to understand that we don't necessarily grab breath or take breath or do anything. It's much better to think about breath as something that happens naturally, and we create the conditions for that air to happen. The diaphragm actually draws air into the body, and we will get more air if our container is wider, is bigger, has more volume capacity. So the one thing that we can do as singers that is most important in this area is to make sure the posture is lifted and high and the rib cage is flexible so that it can accept the air that we do bring into the body. So posture, this is why posture is so important and emphasized by so many singers and teachers of singing. So you can see in these pictures, these opera singers are standing very, very tall and very proud. And there's a reason for that. It is how that instrument is best played. The structure of the rib cage, there is a lot to it we can talk about, but again, important for singers to understand that we have cartilage in the ribs. It's called costal referring to the ribs, costal cartilage. So yes, the ribs are bone, but as they approach the sternum and the ones down below as they approach each other, actually gradually turn into cartilage for flexibility. So the rib cage, we may not be aware of this on a day-to-day basis, but the ribs are actually quite flexible due to that cartilaginous connection or cartilaginous structure that attaches each rib to the sternum or the breastbone, allowing quite a bit of excursion, particularly for ribs 8, 9, and 10. Ribs 11 and 12 are not connected. They're sometimes called floating ribs. But the ones at the bottom of the rib cage, right here, 8, 9, and 10, those are the important structures for breathing in general. But for singers, this is why, again, you see this beautiful posture. And it's something that you will really want to think about being able to cultivate. So now I'm just going to show you some exercises and stretches that you can do to get your body ready for breathing for singing. And so this is a very simple one. Many of us do this just upon rising from bed or in a yoga class, which is a simple and slow bend at the waist down and touch your toes. If you can't touch your toes, touch your ankles or even the fronts of your calves. It's fine. But the idea is that you want to just kind of let everything a little bit loose. And we're looking on the way back up to make sure that we haven't introduced any abdominal tension. Now, it's normal when you're rising back up, the core muscles will kind of contract to stabilize. But see if you can make sure that you're not super, super sucked in when you come back on the way up. And when you get down to the bottom, I kind of like to do a little bit of wiggle. It just helps start to loosen the rib cage and our whole body for singing. So it just simply looks like this. And when I get up to the top, I want to just check in with my abdominal muscles and make sure they're in a sort of neutral position. Again, not super tight and sucked in. I like to say, like, not like when you go to the snack bar at the beach, just a little bit more relaxed than that, but also not completely as if you just had a big meal. So, sort of dynamically engaged. That gets our bodies ready for the next stretch. This next exercise I'm going to show you for respiration is actually my favorite, and I think it's the most important, which is probably why it's my favorite. And it's simply the intercostal stretch. So, reminder that the intercostal muscles are the muscles that are in between the ribs, and we have an external set and an internal set, and we also have an even more internal set. So, it's kind of important to understand that because the intercostal muscles are what protect the lungs. The rib cage, obviously, the bones of the rib cage protect the lungs. But in order for our rib cage to be flexible and expansive, nature made a way for there to be this muscular tissue that was very stretchy, but at the same time, very, very impenetrable. So, one thing I always tell my students and clients to think about is those muscles between the ribs are very sinewy. They're very tough because they are protecting the lungs. The second thing I always mention is the intercostal muscles get no love unless you get it to them, which means in normal walking around, we're not really exercising or stretching those muscles. So, what I like to tell my students is start every day with this stretch where you're going to take one hand over your head and you might just do that for a minute and then come down and do the other side. If you're in really pretty good shape, you can also spread your feet just out a little bit further and maybe do that again and grab your wrist this time and pull off. So good. Pull this way. And then you're going to come on the other side and pull this way. And I might do that for another minute or two, just that back and forth, very gentle movement. Another thing you can do, you can be a little tree waving in the wind, just to sort of feel the motion of that rib cage. Another thing you do is like these little stirs. Now, if you have any spine problems, you should probably watch out for that. But just to kind of start to imagine that width of that rib cage wider and sort of sliding around inside your body is sort of a nice idea. So you're going to do the intercostal stretch. I also like to breathe while I'm doing this, which I'm not doing because I'm talking. So a breathing through your nose or your mouth, and you'll feel that wonderful expansion in your rib cages. It's really hard to feel this feeling in any other posture. So deep breath on that side. I would do this so many times a day as a singer. It's so important. Another thing you can do is basket your hands and stretch up a little bit. Again, you can do those little stirs. Now, here's the important part. Really important part. However, you get out of any of these postures with your arms above your head, it's really important not to go back to normal because when you go back to normal, the rib cage is going to collapse. So, you want to think about this idea that as long as you've gone to the trouble of lifting the rib cage, and when the rib cage goes up, it also expands out. When you've done that, the action of the diaphragm goes with it. The diaphragm is connected inside to the rib cage. So when we do this little up and out, the diaphragm's already kind of waking up. Such an important exercise for singers to start their day. So we go up, we do our stretch, we do our pull, we do our breathe into the side, and we do our breathe into the side. Before we come down, I always tell people, think of it as a counterbalance. So as your arms are going down, you're counterbalancing with this up out movement. So you're not going to let your rib cage collapse. You're going to really counterbalance with up and out and up and out and up and out and up and out. And really watch for that last minute that we don't, that we still stay here. Because one of the things that singers need to cultivate, and it takes a while, cultivation is a good word, cultivate that extremely lifted and wide rib posture, that noble posture from the Italian school that doesn't at the same time recruit your shoulders up like this. So the ability to have that extremely lifted posture and still be able to move your arms around and be expressive as a singer or dance move, whatever you need to do. And it may involve some classes like core Pilates or yoga, or even some personal training sessions to have enough strength in some of these supporting musculature, which I'll help show you another stretch, that will help that support so that we're not just collapsed this way. Finally, and again, importantly, we don't want to have added extraneous abdominal tension this way. So how do you remember that? Think about it this way. We have to have the same posture, the same excellent posture as singers that our friends in performing arts ballet dancers have, with one crucial exception. Dancers must have their abdominal muscles fairly contracted, particularly when they're doing high kicks. That's just the natural way that the body's core stabilizes itself. Singers have to cultivate a little bit less in, I don't say completely relaxed, somewhere dynamic. Again, I'll show you how to find that dynamism. But for now, when you're doing your stretch, you're coming down, but maintaining the width of the rib posture and checking to see that the abs are in a somewhat loose. You can do a little doggy pant just to make sure there's a little dynamism there, but you never want this to collapse. I've found with younger singers, it takes them a while to cultivate this ability for the width in the rib cage without recruiting the trapezius and some of the other shoulder and back muscles to do that work for them. So it's something to cultivate. And one of the major muscles, our fifth muscle in the abdominal group. We have the 4 abdominal wall muscles in this segment. And then we have the fifth, which is called the Quadratus lumborum. That's the muscle that really has to be cultivated in order to hold all this up so it doesn't collapse. So now that we've had our discussion about the intercostal muscles, that is the external intercostal muscles, the ones involved with movement upon inspiration. The next most important inspiratory muscle is the diaphragm. Now, many people have heard about the diaphragm. They've heard expressions like support from your diaphragm. We've heard expressions like breathe from your diaphragm and even sing from your diaphragm. So it's important for us to really understand, what is this muscle? Why does it get so much attention? And spoiler alert, you cannot breathe from your diaphragm, nor can you sing from it. You can breathe through your nose or your mouth, and you sing through your vocal folds and that resonance chamber that enhances that buzz. But the diaphragm is important, but it's been assigned a lot of activities that it really can't do. So what do we want to know about the diaphragm? Let's talk about what it can do, what it actually does during inspiration. Its job is twofold. It is to descend up and down, north, south, and to expand horizontally, laterally, east, west. Those are its 2 actions, down and out. Importantly, the diaphragm is solely a muscle of inspiration. It is active upon inspiration. It is largely passive upon expiration. So let's say that again. When we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and literally pulls air into our body. When it contracts, it moves downward. And if we don't have a lot of excess abdominal tension, our viscera, our guts, will move out of the way. Now, that movement is not the diaphragm. That is the movement of the viscera being pushed out of the way by the downward excursion of the diaphragm. At the same time, the diaphragm also expands laterally. So think again about that rib cage. This is why it is so important for the ribs to not be squished and compressed, to be already open, having expanded their volume, so that when the diaphragm does its job of expanding down and out, we already have a greater volume capacity. So we're kind of moving in a little bit lower into the body, talking about the abdominal musculature, which we're going to cover in great detail in just a moment. But think a little bit about when the abdominal wall is very tight, as if someone was going to come and punch you in the guts. Not very nice, but your instinctive reaction would be for those muscles to become very, very tight and protective. Now, when we're breathing for singing, we actually want the opposite. We want that musculature to be fairly relaxed, although I will come back to that word in a minute. It's a little bit dangerous for singers to think about relaxation. But for now, we'll stick with this idea of the abdominal wall needs to be relaxed enough to accept the air we give it. Another way of saying it is the abdominal wall needs to be relaxed enough so that when I fill up with air, my diaphragm can descend as far as it is able to go. We know that in really good singers, that descension is almost as much as 4 inches. That is a huge measurement when you think about probably we're doing less than half of that on a daily capacity. But singers can train themselves to train this excursion, to pull air into the body. And then we have to work less at taking air. And what I like to teach my singers and clients is accepting the air, thinking much more about creating the capacity for the air to come into the body rather than sucking and pulling air. We'll see why this is so important in the next series, the next segment in this series called phonation, why we don't want to be giving signals to ourselves about taking air. It is really important then at this point that we talk about the abdominal wall being not just relaxed, but I will put a new word out, which is flexible. It needs to be flexible. Now, that is the opposite of tight and restricted, but it's also not like as if you've just eaten a big meal and you're so relaxed you can hardly move. We want to be sort of in the middle of that and have that abdominal wall dynamically available to us, dynamically flexible so that it can move and do the things that we need it to do to create that mysterious word support. So, what can the diaphragm do? It is largely active upon inspiration, largely passive upon expiration. It simply returns to its resting space. It can descend as much as 4 inches into the abdominal cavity as long as the abdominal wall is loose. The movement that we see or feel upon that descension is the viscera or the guts. It's not the diaphragm. We similarly want to know that the diaphragm doesn't just move up and down, it also expands laterally as long as our ribs are flared out and can accept that movement. Now, how we might feel that is something that's important to try when you're warming up. You don't need to spend a long time at it, but I'll show you how to do something I like to call doggy pants and hum laps. The last physical stretch or body movement I like to do for respiration before we start to add tone or singing is just to help singers understand, once again, we're identifying the major components of the breathing apparatus or the breathing machine. Those major components are the rib cage, the muscles of the ribs, and also the abdominal muscles. So I usually have my clients take one hand and I say, just sort of like you're going to make a shelf. And you're going to put that shelf right underneath the bottom of your rib cage. Just a little reminder, as we did in the intercostal stretch, that we're going to make sure that rib cage stays up and flared out, up and out. So we're just kind of a little bit more noble posture. So people who are kind of standing around waiting to get started will find, "Ooh, yeah, I've got to kind of pick that up and out." You might even do another intercostal stretch to get that rib cage up and out. So this was a little hand, little reminder. The other hand, doesn't matter which, you only have two, so whichever one's left over, you're gonna put somewhere in your middle. I don't get too fussy about it. You might want to have people sort of feeling around and feel where their sternum is, but somewhere around their middle. I just try to get people to expand their hands so it's not this, really expansive so we can feel everything. And you're simply going to do some little doggy pants. So, like the littlest dog you can imagine, and you'll just feel that little vibration. I just think this is a great exercise for classical singers to kind of try to find dynamic equilibrium. So we're not like when we go to the snack bar at the beach and we're super pulled in and sucked in. If you try to do a doggy pant in that, you can't because there's not enough flexibility in that abdominal wall. Similarly, if we're super relaxed, it slows down a little bit. So that little high, that little dog with a lot of energy is the idea. So it's a little I sometimes ask my clients to feel when they do the little doggy pant. Are your abs tight? Yes, a little. Are your abs loose? Yes, a little. So that's the right answer. We want them in between, this dynamic equilibrium place in between tight and relaxed so that they can vibrate. Now, that vibration is actually a little bit, it's not the diaphragm, it's actually some of that musculature responding to the changes in subglottic pressure when we're doing the little doggy pant. All right, so once we've done all that, and this stretching routine doesn't have to take more than a few minutes if you don't wish it to, but I usually like to at least make sure that we're going from that point into singing. And so I have different exercises, but I'll pass this one on for now. When after we've done the doggy pant, we're going to just do a little hum laugh. So the idea is you can do it with your lips sealed like a hum. So it's a or you can do it with your tongue out between your teeth. Doesn't matter, really. But what you're going for, what the singer is really trying to notice is a couple of things. We're going to go all the way until we run out of breath. Now, a normal person, not a singer, would go running out of breath, and then we would collapse. We might see this fold over. We definitely would see this come in when people run out of breath. So, what singers train themselves to do is stay in this expanded position no matter what's going on here. Even when the abs are really coming in, you're at the total end of your breath. We still want to stay with that expanded rib cage. So, in order to practice that without putting undue stress onto the voice, or another way of saying is you don't have to sing to do this. You just do a and you'll feel this goes out when you breathe in, and as you use up your air, this goes in a little bit. But this is my pedagogical opinion. I always stress to my singers and clients, this is not a dramatic activity. We're not going hugely out. We're not going hugely in. And if you need to figure out where those borders are, you can do something like if someone was breaking into your car in your garage, you might go, you. And if you said, whoa, you'd feel that's the power of that abdominal wall to supply a lot of subglottic pressure when it's needed. We don't need nearly that much when we sing. And in fact, we want to have a lot more control than that because will cause the pitch to bump, cause the things to jump around in there. So again, it's sort of harkening back to some ideas from motor learning theory that muscles do best with what to do rather than what not to do. And also muscles don't do words very well. They do feeling, they do proprioception. That's their language. So this has been a great check for the singers I work with at all levels to try to remember what's the calibration, what's too much and what's not enough. So if we do And you breathe in, you'll just feel that gentle, and then it comes in, and then there's a gentle out when I breathe in. Then you can start to add tone. So you can you want to do, or you could do always watching for this tendency. So those are just some ways that you can start to bring the respiration system into the phonation system, how those two blend together, how we've gone from some intercostal stretch, some quadratus lumborum stretches, which involve no phonation, to how you start to add that into how it supports literally phonation. So we've completed our discussion about the respiratory muscles of inspiration, of taking breath in. As I mentioned earlier, there are many more involved called secondary muscles of inspiration. But for singers, it is really important to concentrate on those first two. So that is the external, the outside intercostal muscles, X and in, external intercostal muscles that help that rib cage flare up and out in order to accept the air that we bring into the body. And then that important muscle of the diaphragm, which is, as I mentioned, largely passive upon expiration. When the air goes out of the body, the diaphragm simply returns to its space. We have some other muscles that assist that return, and they are responsible for helping the viscera, the guts, go back into their place, and for also helping the rib cage return to its at rest place. Now, it's important to note the latter, many opera singers resist that return. They are taught to stay with that rib cage open, regardless of whether we are breathing in, which should make your abdominal wall go outward, or out. So we're never in this posture of in and out, in and out. We're staying noble, regardless of whether the wall is going in or out or in or out. This stays fairly stable. And this can happen if we really understand the abdominal structure as it supports respiration for singing. So we talk about the expiratory muscles. We have now the expiratory muscles of the rib cage. So we have the internal intercostal muscles that help return the rib cage, or not. We may not recruit those. We may just stay in this expanded position. Then we have four important muscles, which I will tell you the list, and then I'll tell you an easy way to remember them. That list is the external oblique muscles, the internal oblique muscles, the transverse abdominis muscles, and the rectus abdominis muscles. We can think of all four of those muscles as an abdominal wall. That is what they are referred to in the literature, because indeed they create a very important stability structure for the body, but also because their fibers run every which way, we have a north-south, we have an east-west, and we have diagonals running both ways just for good measure. This creates an incredibly strong structure to protect the vital organs, the viscera, so that if we're hit or hurt or something happens to us in this part of the body, it doesn't immediately go through and puncture an organ. Holding all of this up is one of my favorite muscles. It's called the Quadratus lumborum. This is a deep core muscle that holds all of that apparatus together. So let's look at these a little bit again in order. So we have this picture of the muscles of the abdominal wall. And you can see if you look at the picture, we have these fibers that run every which way. The rectus abdominis runs north to south. We have the transverse abdominis running east to west. And then we have the external and internal obliques that run diagonally. So you can see very clearly we have a strong protective wall, hence the name. But it's also important as singers then to say, why do I care to know this? What can I do with this information? Now, in the previous century, there were many leading pedagogues who believed that singers should not do abdominal crunches or shouldn't go to the gym or shouldn't work out too much, that we would create too much rigidity in this abdominal wall to be useful. It was thought that it would also impede that descent and spread of the diaphragm. Well, in more modern science-based research, we know, first of all, I like to say, only half joking, I have seldom met some abs that were overworked. So I personally advocate some good muscle tone. I think it's fine to do responsible ab workouts that create muscle tone that will allow the flexibility in that abdominal wall without becoming overly rigid, but also when they are too flaccid and too out of shape, they're really not at our control. So I do think that singers should probably get on a nice fitness routine, something normal, something that you can keep up with, that you're not at the gym trying to do 3 hours of ab reps, because that probably will create some rigidity that we wouldn't want. Particularly when we think about the excursion of the diaphragm and the excursion of those lower ribs 8, 9, and 10. So now let's talk about the last of our abdominal muscles. We spoke about the abdominal wall that creates this, sometimes it's referred to as a girdle, which is a really nice word for what it actually does, which is protect the vital organs. We've also talked about the intercostal muscles. Now we sort of look at the last of these muscles, which is my favorite muscle name, the Quadratus lumborum, which functions a little bit the way a house is built. You put the foundation down, and before you build the walls, you have to build the structure. So these muscles are deep core muscles, sort of columnar. They're like the sides of a wall. They hold up everything. They hold up and stabilize the rib cage, or even more generically, we could say they stabilize the thorax. So, this in and out breathing action, which for us as vocal athletes is much more pronounced than the normal person on the street, because we really want to use that excursion of the diaphragm 4 inches down possibility, as well as the spread of the rib cage. That's a lot of activity during robust singing. And there has to be some sort of internal structure that holds us up and makes it possible for us to use those driving forces this way and this way, so that we're not always being sort of pulled and pushed around. So the QL, the quadratus lumborum, is a very important muscle, and there is some thought about ways that you can exercise that. So after you've done your intercostal side stretch, you can still stay in the same configuration and almost the same mindset, because what you're going to focus on now is this deep core muscle called the quadratus lumborum. Quadratus lumborum muscle is the fifth in our 5 abdominal area muscles. So we have the 4 that are the abdominal wall, and then we have this fifth muscle called the quadratus lumborum that I like to say just holds up the whole works. It holds up that rib cage and allows singers to drive some of that abdominal wall this way, in and out, this way, without heaving in the rib cage. So if you see really, really skilled singers, you never see this. It's always, you can see some activity going in and out this way, but you're not going to see that collapse of the rib cage. Obviously, many, many muscles involved, but probably the most important one is the QL, the quadratus lumborum. And there are lots of exercises that you can do for this. If you're standing, it's called picking apples, and it literally looks like I'm picking apples. So, yes, it's a kind of intercostal stretch, but in that stretch, we were stretching a little bit more dramatically to the side to try to expose that rib cage. Now we're just kind of focusing more on this deep core muscle in here and going more up this way. Now, in order to get the most effectiveness, I actually like to stand with my feet fairly close together. Why am I doing that? Because if I'm standing with my feet wide apart like that, I'm getting a sort of artificial support this way. So what I'm going to do is put my feet a little bit closer together, maybe even super close. Ooh, and I have to do that. I have to zip my abs up just a little bit to provide that core stability. That's helping me kind of wake up that QL. So I'm going to go up like I'm picking apples and picking apples Picky apples. This is a great one to do after you've done your intercostal side stretch. Most of us are well aware of some fantastic stretches out there on YouTube. There's a kind of QL stretch that you can do seated or sitting. However you get at that QL, there are several ways to do it. This one I like because you're standing. If you're a performer and you're waiting to go on stage, this is one of the best things that you can do. These intercostal side stretches where you're breathing deeply, and you can use a slow breath in, slow breath out. If you have any kind of excitement or performance anxiety, this will help. And you're doing that intercostal side stretch. And then at the same time, you're going to zip those feet together a little bit more and do that QL. All the while breathing through your nose or your mouth, it doesn't matter. Checking to see if the abs are in this dynamic position. They're neither super tight and sucked in, but they're not after a huge meal that relaxed. So we're kind of looking for that nice dynamic balance in that supporting musculature. So, what might we make of all this? The idea about the breathing apparatus can be as complex or as simple as a singer would like to make it. But there are some things that we can think about. And the first is fairly basic. If you have a choice as a singer, stand up. Now, opera singers stand up, but they are sometimes asked to do movement by their stage directors. This is where things can get very interesting. If you're asked to sit down, no problem. You just sit very tall because you're always trying to be aware, particularly of those ribs 8, 9, and 10. If you're sitting like this, that rib cage can become very collapsed, can become very difficult to get not only the breath that you need, but to help that excursion of the diaphragm. Remember, down and out, that diaphragm needs to go. So do the ribs. So stand up as much as possible. The second thing would be if you're asked to do something really unusual in your staging, and I've seen it. I have seen people, including myself, being asked to do things like lie down on a chaise lounge and sing upside down. Very hard for the rib cage, or to be carried around, or to lie on your stomach and sing. These are very difficult postures for singers, and you might have to negotiate with your stage director and help them understand this is where the science information is very important, because you don't want to go to your stage director and just argue with them about how you can't sing in that position. But you could, and you would be factually accurate by explaining to them that your instrument does not work well that way. You will not get the amount of air that you need in some of these more compromised positions. So, my hope for science informed voice pedagogy is that it doesn't just go to the teachers and the singers, but that it expands outward to our coaches and our stage directors so that they are more informed about what they ask artists to do on stage and how it may or may not compromise the instrument. If you're a singer who has to play an instrument and you're playing a guitar, you're playing the piano, obviously these are things that would cause that rib cage to collapse a little bit, which is maybe what it has to do in order to play those instruments. But you also want to make sure that you stand up in between sets and you stretch that rib cage so that at least you get a little bit out of that compressed posture. Remember, at the end of the day, collapsed posture equals compressed musculature. And that means the diaphragm cannot expend its full excursion. Now, I want to show you some expiration exercises. There are some teachers of singing who like to spend a lot of time on expiration and inspiration exercises. I certainly like to do a few, but I like to very soon put voice behind that. So I'll just show you a few. Now, this first one is called box breathing. It's not mine. Box breathing is a technique that's been around for a long time. One of its side benefits is that it helps calm the nervous system. So this is a great technique to use if you have any performance anxiety at all, or even performance excitement. It can just sort of help regulate breathing. So as the name goes, box, it's 4 equal sides. So the idea is that you breathe in slowly 4 times, you suspend that count of 4, you breathe out for another count of 4, and then you suspend again before you start the whole process over again. Now that sounds fairly simple. This is something that any human can do, but if you want to use box breathing for its most effective use as a singer, we're just going to add a few more directives to that. So we're going to breathe in through the mouth for a count of 4, not through the nose. I'll explain that in a minute. You breathe in through the mouth for a count of 4, and you suspend, but you do not hold your breath. Explain that in a minute. Then you breathe out for a count of 4. Doesn't matter whether it's through the nose or the mouth at that point. And then we suspend.